Praise the Lord. Good to have each one of you here with us, and we want to greet all those that will be watching online. And I pray that God will meet you in a special way wherever you may be and minister to you. We'll continue with our study of the book of Acts. We are in chapter 26. And let me just say before we even begin reading the verses, we are in 26 and we will very likely complete chapter 26 today, begin chapter 27. Just keep in mind, I believe that the book of Acts has 28 chapters, so we are getting very close to the end of the book of Acts. All right, so we're going to pick up with verse 29 of chapter 26, verse 29. And it says, Paul replied, and this is him giving his defense before King Agrippa and Governor Festus. And he says, Paul replied, short time alone, I pray God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. And the king rose, and with him the governor, and Bernice, and those sitting with them. And they left the room. And while talking with one another, they said, this man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Okay, so he responds to King Agrippa. What was he responding to? Remember when he said, do you believe the prophets? And he said, I know that you do. And King Agrippa says, do you think that in such a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian? And this is where we pick up, and this is his reply to King Agrippa's statement. And he said, whether it be a short time or a long time. And he says, I pray that at some point you will become just like me, except for these chains. So I thought about that for a moment, and I said, well, we don't really want it to be a long time. We like it if it's a short time. But what he says is true. If he ends up becoming, his prayer, his desire, is that no matter how long it takes, my prayer is that at some point in your life, before you leave this world, you're going to become like I am. And what he meant by that was simply you will become a follower of Christ. And he said, except for the fact that I pray you don't have to suffer the persecution that I'm suffering. And it's not an invitation when he says whether it be short time or long. It's not an invitation. Nobody should receive that as saying I can procrastinate. I have all the time in the world. I'm not going to. I plan on doing it. It may not be now, but I plan on doing it someday. That's not what he's suggesting, and that would be a very, very poor position for any of us to take. Becoming understand you don't know what's going to happen the rest of the day today, much less tomorrow, right? So the best thing that we can do is make a decision for Christ today. As I thought about that, I thought I cannot imagine anything that would be more heartbreaking than to have made up my mind that I'm going to receive Christ, but I'm going to wait till next Sunday to do it, and then you don't make it till next Sunday. And then you enter eternity saying, Lord, I meant to, and that's not going to count for much then. So upon hearing these words, King Agrippa and Governor Festus and all that accompanied them, they all got up to leave the room. And we mentioned last week, I believe, there was probably three objectives that the Apostle Paul had in making the presentation, because we said he understood, and we understand that no matter what happened as he made this presentation before King Agrippa, he couldn't be released. And say, why not? Because he appealed to Caesar. So why is he making this defense if he still has to go to Caesar? And I mentioned three objectives. One of them was that as he got a chance to defend himself, he wanted them to agree that they could find no fault in him. And really you see that desire, that objective was met, because what was King Agrippa's statement? He says, it's a shame that he appealed to Caesar, because had he not appealed, we find no basis of any charge for death or imprisonment. Right? He could have been set free right now, but he appealed to Caesar. To Caesar he must go. And I thought about that. He made his defense before Festus, before he made it before King Agrippa. And I believe Festus could have made the same decision before he appealed to Caesar, because there really was no basis of the charges made against him They could not be proven. There was no basis for them. Festus could have made the decision, I find nothing, in the charges against you, and he could have released them. But because Paul sensed that Festus was playing games and was making agreements to please the Jews, he said, I'm not going to get a fair trial. So rather he says, I appeal to Caesar.
I still look at it that we've talked many, many times about how come the people, when they wanted to kill Jesus, they couldn't kill Jesus because it wasn't his time. And God had done told him he was going wrong. And so this was his way to go wrong. I mean, God had already had a destination for him to go. And we can look back and say, well, if he had opened his mouth and said that, he'd be here. But his intention, God's intention was for him to go to Rome.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. All these things are working out. And we could say, had he not appealed, he would have been. But the reality is, you're right, that God had already ordained that he was going to go to stand before Caesar. As we go into chapter 27, you see, even when he's on the boat and all those terrible things are happening on their journey, and he says, the Lord came and told him, you are going to stand before Caesar and trial before Caesar. So even then he repeats it. No matter what's happening, that's my plan. That's my plan. So his plan will be fulfilled. All right, so that concludes chapter 26. So we're going to begin with chapter 27. Verse 1 says, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. So when he says that it was decided, when and by whom was it decided that Paul would go to Italy? When and by whom?
Against Agrippa. Wouldn't be by Agrippa.
No.
I mean, they had just said he appealed to go to Caesar, so.
He did.
But they had to have been the ones that let it go.
But the appeal was made to Festus. Right? And let me read it to you. That's found in chapter 25, verse 12. It says, after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. So the next question, why were they sailing to Italy?
They had no non-stop.
Well, but why was it Italy? Why go to Italy? Because they were going to Rome. Rome is the capital of Italy, and that's where they go to meet Caesar. So they were going to Italy. That's why it says they were going to set sail for Italy. And there were several, in addition to Paul, there were several other prisoners that were handed over to this centurion named Julius. And verse 2 says, we boarded a ship from Adramyttium, and about to sail for ports along the coast of province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. Right, so they're setting sail, and he mentions there's somebody else that was traveling with them. Does anybody remember anything about this guy named Aristarchus? He's mentioned several times. Let me share with you a few of them. He was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. We see him mentioned in Acts 19, verse 29. It says this, soon the whole city was in an uproar, and the people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and rushed as one man into the theater. And now he's joining Paul, not as a fellow prisoner, but as a voluntary companion of the apostles. And he was willing to share in whatever danger, because that was a dangerous thing to do, to say, I'll go with him and travel with him as he's going to Rome. But he did it, and he willing to share the dangers, whatever dangers Paul might face. And it appears that he was imprisoned with Paul when they finally do get to Rome. Look at Colossians 4:10. Paul wrote there, and he says, my fellow prisoner, Aristarchus, sends you his greetings. As I read these verses, I'm reminded that even now, in the midst of persecution, God so often will send someone to come alongside us to be an encouragement to us. God does that so often. And this is what he did here. He sent his dear brother to go along with him and be an encouragement to him. And he was willing to be imprisoned, and he was. Verse 3, the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, now who was Julius? The centurion, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. So here you have another example of God watching out for the Apostle Paul, right? So first we see that he has this Aristarchus who's willing to travel with him. And I would imagine if you're in a situation like that, having somebody that's a fellow Christian with you, standing by your side, would have been a great source of strength and encouragement. But not only that, that was having a Christian there. But now he has this centurion who also, he finds favor with him. And he says, as an act of kindness, he lets him go to his friends so that his needs might be met. And I look at that as simply an act of grace on the part of God toward the Apostle Paul. Verse 4, from there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. When I read that and passed to the lee of Cyprus, I was wondering, well, what's the lee of Cyprus? Let me read it to you from the New Living Translation, may put it a little easier. It says, putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north of Cyprus between the island and the mainland. And as they continued to travel, Julius finds a ship that's sailing for Italy and puts the prisoners on board. So that first ship that we mentioned was going in the general direction, but it appears that it wasn't going directly to Italy. But now they switch ships, and he puts them in this ship that is destined for Italy. Verse 7, we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off, and that's pronounced Nidus. And when the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to here's the lee again, the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. And the New Living Translation puts that like this. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Nidus. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across the Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Salmone. Verse 8, we moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lycia. And much time had been lost, and sailing had become very dangerous, because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, men, I see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. So notice what it says. They continue to have difficulties. This whole trip is going to be filled with challenges. They continue to have difficulties in their journey, and a lot of time had passed already. It said by this time the trip was becoming very dangerous. The New Living Translation translates verse 9 like this. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And the NIV says sailing had already become dangerous because it was now after the fast. So what did he mean by that? He said sailing had become difficult because it was now after the fast. And that was a reference to the Day of Atonement, the fast associated with the Day of Atonement, which occurred in late September or early October. So it was the time of the year. I think even now when we say, well, that's kind of hurricane season here, it was the kind of year where storms came up. So he says that that things were becoming dangerous because it was now after the fast associated with the Day of Atonement. And now Paul gives them a warning. Now note the warning, you see it in verse 10. He says, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo and to our own lives also. Now he gave that warning, but it tells us that the centurion listened to the pilot and to the owner of the ship instead of to Paul. Right? And perhaps he didn't know who Paul was, perhaps he had any idea this is the man of God, but he would have been wise to listen to the man of God. Look at verse 12. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. And when a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought that they had obtained what they wanted. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island, and the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. So here you see the beginning of the warning taking place. And notice what it says. It starts off by saying that the majority decided that this was a good course of action to take. I read that and I thought to myself, isn't it true that very often the majority, what they believe is not the right thing? The decision that the majority makes is often not the right decision. And it led to an encounter with hurricane force winds. Now, if you have the King James in front of you, you would take note that it describes, it has a name for this storm. It's called Euroclydon, right? And if you were to look up the Greek word that's translated by that word, Euroclydon, this is the only place that it appears in the entire New Testament. So what does the word mean? Sometimes some people say it was not very clear what it means, but I believe it says this. One commentator put it like this: the most probable supposition is that it denotes a wind not blowing steadily from any quarter, but a hurricane, or wind veering about to different quarters. In other words, it wasn't that there was a wind going north, it was a wind that was swirling around. And I think that's why I think the NIV translated it correctly by that description as that it was a hurricane. And they could not go against the direction of the wind. Wherever they wanted to go, if that wind started blowing against them, they couldn't go forward. So after a while, they just said, well, let's just go wherever the wind takes us, right? And that's what they did. Verse 16, as we passed to the lee, here's the lee again, of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. Now, you know the lifeboat, you know what that is, right? It's a smaller ship that's attached usually to a bigger ship for emergency. If something happened, you could jump in the lifeboat and try if the big ship was starting to sink. So it says they were hardly able to secure the lifeboat because of all the winds. The NLT again translates it like this: we sailed along the sheltered side of the small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hosted aboard the lifeboat, being towed behind us. So they were trying their best to save the lifeboat because they saw that they were in trouble, right? And obviously they were having a great difficulty doing this. Look at verse 17. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. And fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. Right? So here was the fear. Everything was getting so bad, the winds were so strong, that they were thinking it might just tear this boat apart. And it's interesting, as I looked at that, I was told, now it may not be true today, but commentaries that I looked at, maybe written 100 years ago, they'll say that's the same thing that they do today. If it's a wooden ship like that, they would pass the ropes underneath and put them up the other side and try to do something to hold the ship together, right? And that's what they were trying to do. Look at it again. Fearing that they were run aground. Now, what's the sandbar? So they tied the ropes around the ship, trying to hold it together. And the next part says, fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars asserted, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. What are sandbars? For what I read, sandbars.
I just say it's a shallow place where the land juts out. It's not very deep.
Yes, it is the land. The land gets up close, high, and if the boat comes near that, it'll get damaged. It'll get damaged. So it says to avoid that. It says they, and because they were afraid of that, and that they would run aground at the sandbar, they said they lowered the sea anchor. Now it's interesting. What does that mean? This NIV says they lowered the sea anchor. The King James translates that phrase and says they straight sailed. So I said, well, now I don't know what the first one meant. Now I don't know what the second one means. So what does the straight sail mean? And when I looked it up further, what it appeared to mean was that at that point they took the mast off. You know the mast they put on so the wind hits it, it takes you? That they lowered the mast. And look what it says, and let the ship be driven along. So it wasn't any longer being directed by the direction the mast was pointing in, but they just lowered it, and they allowed the wind to take the ship wherever it wanted to take them. All right? Now look at verse 18. We took such a violent battery from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Now, why do you think, and that's probably not an unusual thing to happen in situations like this. Why would anybody in a situation like this want to throw cargo overboard?
They want to sink.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is to lighten the load, and that's...
in the water.
Huh?
So it wasn't said it's flowing in the water.
Yes, and that's really how it is often described as lightening the load. Now, and I said, think of another case where a ship was in trouble in the scriptures and did the same thing. Anybody think of it?
Jonah.
Yes, it is Jonah. And that's in chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. And then it says, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. And all the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. All right? So that was the practice. Now look at verse 19. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So I had to look up somebody and say, well, which part is this and which part is that? All you fishermen here might know all these things. But when I looked it up, it describes the tackle as being those things besides the cargo, and it'd be besides food as well. That's the last thing they threw overboard. Besides the cargo that would help lighten the ship. And that would include anchors, sails, cables, baggage, everything like that. So they threw everything that was not indispensable to their survival. They started to throw that overboard as well in order to lighten the load and increase the chances of their survival. Now look at verse 20. This is really a remarkable account of what took place there. It says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So why could they see neither sun nor stars? Yeah, if you think of a very fast storm, normally the sky is dark and you hardly see any clouds, you don't see the sun. Surely, usually it's kind of just the same color all across the dark. But what was the significance of that in addition to the fact that it shows us a fast storm? What else did the sun and the stars provide that they were lacking now? Yes, navigation, right? They said very often when they're out in the sea, they say, well, where am I going? They probably didn't have the compass like we have then. So how did they know? Did they look at the stars? And they say, well, that's the North Star here. They say, I know I'm going in this right direction. If the sun is coming up, they say, well, it's coming up. And which way does it come up? It goes up in the east. Right? It goes down in the west. So when they can tell, when they see the place of the sun, they see the stars where they are, they can say, I know where I'm going. But in a situation like this, where it was all the same and there was no stars and no sun, and very dark, they couldn't even look for any land that would give some idea of where they are. So they didn't know where they were going, what they were doing, and the storm was raging so bad. And it's very powerful to me that it says at that point, he said, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Right? They gave up all hope of being saved. As I was studying, I looked at, most of us are familiar with Pastor and writer John MacArthur. I looked up something he wrote about it, and he described the situation like this. He says, only those who have been in a violent storm at sea can fully appreciate the terror the passengers and crew must have felt. The towering white-capped seas, the roaring of the wind, the violent rocking of the ship, at first the bow and then the stern rose high into the air, only to plunge quickly down again. The constant motion, the inducing seasickness, and making it difficult to stand, let alone walk. The wind-driven salt spray stinging and blinding those exposed on deck. And worst of all, the looming reality of an awful death by drowning. All those factors combine to unnerve even the most experienced sailor. And someone who hasn't been in the middle of a storm like that, that was very revealing to me. And I can see how that would be the case, how disturbing that would be. And how when they were there and all of that is going on, and I can't see where I don't know where I'm going, I don't see any sign, I don't know what's going on, or I know that we're being tossed back and forth all over the place. Look at verse 21. It says, after the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Right? So now notice first of all that Paul took note that these men had not eaten food in a long time. Later on we'll see, I believe, it was about 14 days had passed. And he said, notice that they have been without food. Why were they not eating? They still have food on the board. Why were they not eating?
Or maybe seasick.
Well, they said they could.
They couldn't eat.
Yeah, it could have been seasickness.
Fear.
And it could have been the distress of all that's going on. If you're in a situation where you feel I might get thrown overboard, or this boat might cut it. The last thing maybe you may be thinking about is a hamburger and fries. You know,
Yeah,
you're just thinking about it. Yeah. But you add to that the fact that they may have been very seasick from them moving around. And of course I think you add the factor that they were very discouraged. Right? So you had discouragement, you had seasickness, you had all that going on at one time that would distract anybody from food. So Paul says he noticed they had gone a long time without food, but he stands up and he says, listen, you should have listened to me. But what did he say?
Stay where they were at.
Yeah, and he said that back in verse 10 of this same chapter. Is what he told them. You should stay right here because you're going to suffer loss, and you should stay. He said, you should have listened to me when I said that. But he says, but now, keep up your courage, because not one of you is going to be lost. I think how God is so gracious that even in the midst of situations like that, he would send a word like that. How comforting was now, it would have been extremely comforting to the Apostle Paul. But keep in mind, part of the reason he can have confidence is because God told him, you're going to go to Rome. But even to the others to hear that, him say is everything's going to be all right. Every single person here is going to make it, but the ship is going to be lost. Verse 23. Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men. For I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. And nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So God not only had spoken into the heart of the Apostle Paul, but here he says an angel appeared to him to give him this message again, right? And he says, listen, Paul, don't be afraid. You will stand trial before Caesar, like we told you at the beginning, and God has graciously given you the lives of all these men that were traveling with you. Now notice, he says, it wasn't because of the righteousness of the men that were traveling with us. They probably were not even believers in God. But he says, God has, look at it again, how it says it, but God has graciously given you the lives of all these men. God did it as an act of grace toward the Apostle Paul, right? So he says, keep up your courage. He says, because I know, I have faith, I have confidence that what the angel of the Lord told me is going to happen just as he said, right? And everybody's going to make it to the end. But we will run aground. Now notice that at the end too. He says, you're all going to make it, be of good courage. It's going to work out. He's going to give you the lives of all these people. And then he adds in verse 26, nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. I read that, I thought, well, isn't it true that so very often when God said, you know, I'm going to deliver, I'm going to set the captive free, I'm going to show myself strong on the behalf of the people and do so many glorious things, but in the midst of all the things that God is doing, there's still something that we have to endure, right? God's going to come. You look at some of our brothers and sisters that are in prison. If they get released, God says, I'm going to set you free, don't worry. But they may still have had to spend years in prison before they got released. So sometimes even as God has shown himself strong and God is moving in our behalf, does not mean that we're never going to go through anything, right? Sometimes we still need to go through some hardship even as we see the hand of God. Matter of fact, if you look at the nation of Israel, they experienced the greatest deliverance that anyone has ever experienced in the history of the world, being delivered out of Egypt. But they were 400 years in Egypt, right? So God shows up. Even when people say, you know, I thank God, everybody that gets up and gives this testimony, I thank God because he supernaturally, miraculously healed me. Even if they don't mention the words, it is understood that you were sick. God allowed you to be sick. And then he showed his power in your life by coming and supernaturally ministering to you. So sometimes we just have to go through something, even as we see God move in a mighty way in our lives. Let's go to verse 27. We won't be able to complete all of this, but let me just read it. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. Let me stop there and just ask the question. This is the 14th night. So it says the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. So my question is, how can someone sense that they're approaching land?
Probably there, they maybe hear the breakers, you know, the waves hit the shore, rocks or whatever.
Okay. What else?
The water been getting shallower?
Well, I don't know if they can see that, but maybe they can see
feel it.
Maybe they can see the waves acting differently because it's shallow. Somebody put it like the rippling of the tide, and maybe that has to do with that. Someone mentioned that perhaps they saw seabirds that usually are around where there's land. They see a lot of birds that's usually around land. And someone even mentioned that it's possible, I've never been in a situation like that, but it's possible, they say, that as you approach land, where you've been out in the ocean, that you can even smell something different, smell the land. So it may have been one or a combination of all these things, but somehow what was taking place laid in the mind of the sailors that we think we're approaching land. And I will read this one. Verse 28, we'll stop with that one. It says they took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. So what is a sounding?
Yeah, it's when they measure how deep the water
Yes, yes. Now the first one, if we didn't know anything about it, the first thought that might come to somebody is, are they doing something that has to do with sound? They call it a sounding. But that's not the case. You're right. You could take a piece of some kind of a weight and hang it on a string, and you drop it in the water and let it hit the ground a couple of times so you know it's actually hit ground, and then attach something like a clip or something to where it hits the top of the water, and you take it out and you measure it, and you know this is how deep the land is. Notice what it says here. It says they took the sounding, and the first time they took it, they found out that the water was 120 feet deep. Then what did they do next? They took soundings again. The second time they took the soundings, they found that it was 90 feet deep. What was the significance of the second sounding?
Yeah.
And what did that mean? Yes, right. We mentioned that before. The fact that that land, as we mentioned, the sand, what was the sand? What's the word? Sand drifts, or that we talked about? Was it sand drifts? What was the word? I forget, but the same idea.
Sandbar.
Sandbars? Okay. So here it's the same thing. And people do that, I think, regularly. So when they did that, they realized it is true. The sailors sensed it, they even smelled it, saw the signs, saw the birds, and then they took the sounding to confirm it. And it confirmed they were getting closer and closer to land. And that was a good thing. Okay, I'm going to stop there. What we'll do next time is pick up we'll start with verse 27 next time and add more information to it. Does anybody have any comments or questions they'd like to make before we get ready to close in prayer? Bow your heads with me as we look to the Lord. Father, we do thank you for these few minutes we could spend looking at your word. And Father, I pray, Lord, that we were touched by it. Lord, that we received some insights in it that would help us in our walk with you, to trust you more, to be more obedient to you, to look to you in all things. Father, I pray, Lord, that you would help us, Lord, that we would take note of everything that you're doing, and that we would be so grateful every time you send a word of comfort, a word of consolation, a word of encouragement to us. And we know, Lord, that whenever we're going through difficulties, you're right there. And not only is your presence there, but so very often you'll send someone to come alongside us and speak a word in due season to encourage our hearts. So Father, as we get ready to close, I pray that you will go with each one, take them safely to their next destination. I pray, Lord, that your Spirit will continue to speak into our lives and reveal your truth to us, and then bring us back at the next appointed time. We ask all of this in the name that truly is above every other name, the name of Jesus. And everyone said, Amen.